They came for freedom, but whose freedom was it? The story we tell ourselves is simple. Men and women crossed an ocean to escape tyranny. They sought a new Eden, a place where conscience could speak without fear, where faith could flourish without kings or bishops breathing down their necks. The Mayflower cuts through grey Atlantic waves in our imagination, carrying pilgrims toward destiny. We see them kneeling in the sand, thanking God for deliverance. We see log cabins rising from virgin forests. We see the birth of something pure. But every myth conceals as much as it reveals. The colonists did seek freedom. Yes, freedom to impose their will on others, freedom to accumulate land and wealth, freedom to build hierarchies as rigid as any they left behind. Religious liberty was never universal. It extended to the right congregation, the right skin color, the right willingness to bow before the particular god that held power in that particular settlement. Tolerance was a word spoken rarely and meant even less often. The ships that crossed the Atlantic carried Bibles and muskets in equal measure. They carried investors' ledgers and company charters. They carried dreams, certainly, but also appetites for gold, for land, for dominion over wilderness and the people who lived there. The colonies were never just refuges. They were experiments in profit. They were outposts of empire. They were places where European wars and hatreds could be replayed on fresh soil, where old debts could be settled with new violence. The people already here, the ones who had lived on this land for thousands of years, were never part of the freedom equation. Neither were the Africans dragged in chains to work fields they would never own. Freedom, in the colonial imagination, was not a shared sunrise. It was a fortress, and the walls were built to keep most of humanity out. The dream of a new world was real enough. The question is, new for whom, and at what cost? The Virginia Company sold shares in salvation. Investors in London imagined rivers running with gold, forests thick with treasure, a return that would make them rich beyond measure. What they built instead was Jamestown, a fortress of desperation clinging to a malarial swamp. The settlers arrived in 1607, expecting to find wealth lying on the ground like fallen fruit. They were gentlemen unused to labour, soldiers without an enemy worth fighting, craftsmen without materials or purpose. They did not plant enough corn. They did not dig proper wells. They quarrelled over rank and rations while the wilderness pressed in around them. Within months, men were dying of starvation, disease, and something darker, the simple inability to imagine survival without someone else doing the work. The Powhatan Confederacy watched these strange, pale men stumble through the seasons. At first there was curiosity, even assistance. Pocahontas, barely more than a child, became a bridge between worlds in ways the English never truly honoured. But the colonists' hunger was not for friendship, it was for land. Every treaty was temporary, every gift was prelude to demand. When the English needed food, they took it. When they needed space, they burned villages and claimed the ashes. The starving time came in 1609. Men ate horses, then dogs, then rats, then leather boiled into glue. Some whispered of darker meals still, bodies exhumed from shallow graves. When supply ships finally arrived, they found barely 60 colonists alive from a population of 500. The survivors looked like walking corpses, yet they did not leave. The company would not permit failure. More ships came, more settlers, more guns. Tobacco saved Jamestown, though salvation is perhaps the wrong word. John Rolfe discovered that Virginia soil could grow a crop England craved, and suddenly the colony had purpose. Fields spread like a rash across stolen land. The Powhatans resisted, were crushed, resisted again. Treaties were signed and broken with the regularity of seasons. By 1622, the Powhatans launched a coordinated assault that killed nearly a third of the colonists. The English response was total war crops burned, villages destroyed, peace abandoned forever. Jamestown survived not through virtue or divine favour, but through relentless, grinding violence. The gold they sought was always in the ground, purchased in blood and measured in acres of another people's home. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, carrying an image of themselves as humble servants fleeing persecution. They saw themselves as righteous remnant, God's chosen few escaping the corruptions of the Church of England. The mythology would later paint them as paragons of tolerance, founders of American virtue. The truth was narrower and harder than the legend allows. They came not to build freedom of conscience for all, but to establish their own uncompromising vision of godliness. The separatists who landed in 1620 believed they alone possessed the correct interpretation of Scripture. Dissent was not a right, but a danger. When Roger Williams dared to suggest that civil government should not enforce religious conformity, the Massachusetts Bay Colony banished him into winter wilderness. When Anne Hutchinson held Bible studies that drew crowds and challenged ministerial authority, she was tried, convicted, and expelled. The Puritans demanded liberty for themselves and conformity from everyone else. Their laws were Scripture made flesh. Adultery meant death. Blasphemy meant the whipping post or worse. The Sabbath was enforced with fines and stockades. Children who struck their parents could be executed. Though the law was rarely used, the threat alone was enough. Quakers who dared to preach in Massachusetts were stripped, whipped through the streets, and driven out. When they returned, as their faith demanded, they were hanged on Boston Common. Mary Dyer went to the gallows in 1660, martyred for refusing to abandon her beliefs. The rope that killed her was pulled by men who claimed to understand religious freedom. The witch hunts were the Puritan experiment's fever dream made real. Salem in 1692 was a community eating itself alive with suspicion. Neighbors accused neighbors, children testified against parents. Spectral evidence testimony about dreams and visions was admitted in court. 20 people were executed. More died in prison. The panic spread like plague because the Puritan worldview left room for it. They believed in a universe of constant spiritual warfare, where the devil lurked behind every misfortune and every mysterious illness. When crops failed or children sickened, someone had to be blamed. The witch trials were not an aberration but an expression of the system's deepest logic. The Puritans built schools and valued literacy because they wanted everyone to read the Bible. They established forms of local governance that would influence American democracy. But they also built a society where deviation from orthodoxy could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. Their virtue was real, and so was their cruelty. Both grew from the same root. America would become the land of opportunity, the place where any man could rise through hard work and virtue. The colonial reality was a society as stratified as the Europe they left behind, with class lines drawn in land ownership, birth, and the color of one's skin. The wealthy controlled everything that mattered. In Virginia, the great planters lived like petty nobility, their estates sprawling across thousands of acres worked by servants and slaves. They held seats in the House of Burgesses, administered justice as magistrates, commanded the militia. Their sons married their neighbors' daughters, weaving networks of kinship and power that locked out newcomers. A poor man might own his plot of land eventually, if he survived his indenture, but he would never sit in the councils where decisions were made. In New England, the town fathers controlled land distribution. The best parcels went to the earliest settlers, to men of standing and proven godliness. Later arrivals received smaller portions on the margins. The sons of proprietors inherited status along with acreage. Social mobility existed in theory, but the reality was a ladder with broken rungs. You could rise from poverty to modest comfort through brutal labor and good fortune, but the gap between a yeoman farmer and a merchant prince was a chasm few could cross. The myth of opportunity required winners, and winners required losers. Indentured servants were promised land after their terms expired, but many died before freedom came. Those who survived often found the good land already claimed, the opportunities already seized by those who arrived first or had capital to invest. By the late 1600s, former servants were drifting to the frontier, landless and angry, looking for someone to blame for promises that rang hollow. Race became the ultimate boundary. A white man, however poor, could imagine himself part of the community of free citizens. An African, enslaved or free, was categorically excluded. The laws made this explicit, prohibiting intermarriage, restricting the testimony of black witnesses, marking skin color as the indelible sign of subordinate status. The opportunity the colonies offered was always selective, always contingent, always built on the assumption that some people were meant to serve and others to command. The dream of rising through merit was not entirely false. Some men did accumulate wealth and respect through industry. But the system was designed to reward those who started with advantages and to trap those who began with nothing. The colonies replicated hierarchy, gave it a fresh coat of paint, and called it freedom. Before the ships arrived, the land was not empty. It was home to nations with names, languages, laws, and histories stretching back millennia. The Wampanoag, the Powhatan, the Pequot, the Narragansett, the Iroquois Confederacy. These were not wandering bands but organized societies with agriculture, trade networks, and diplomatic relations. The colonists saw wilderness where there was actually careful management, savagery where there was culture, absence where there was presence. The first encounters were tentative, transactional. Native peoples traded furs and food for metal tools and cloth. They taught the newcomers how to grow corn, where to fish, how to survive winters that killed Europeans by the dozens. Without this aid, the early colonies would have perished. The mythology remembers Thanksgiving, the moment of fellowship between pilgrim and Indian. It forgets that within a generation, the Wampanoag would be nearly destroyed, their leader's head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years. The English hunger for land was insatiable and absolute. They did not recognize native concepts of land use and shared territory. They demanded deeds and titles, imposed European legal frameworks on people who had never conceived of earth as property to be bought and sold. Every treaty was negotiated in bad faith. Every boundary was temporary. When native leaders protested encroachment, they were told they had sold the land, that their mark on a document they could not read had transferred ownership forever. Resistance was met with overwhelming violence. The Pequot War of 1637 ended with English soldiers and their native allies surrounding a village and setting it ablaze. Hundreds burned to death or were cut down fleeing the flames. William Bradford, Plymouth's governor, watched the massacre and thanked God for delivering the enemy into their hands. King Philip's War in 1675 was even more devastating. A desperate confederacy of tribes fighting colonial expansion across New England. When it ended, native power in the region was shattered. Metacom, called King Philip by the English, was hunted down, killed, beheaded, and quartered. His wife and son were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The forgotten truth is that native peoples did not simply vanish or fade into the wilderness. They were systematically dispossessed, killed, enslaved, and driven from their homes. Their villages were burned, their crops destroyed, their children taken and raised in English households. Survivors were pushed to reservations or marginal lands, confined and controlled. Colonial memory erased them deliberately, replacing living peoples with romantic myths of noble savages or dangerous heathens. The forgetting was not accidental. It was policy. To build a new world, the old one had to be destroyed and then denied. Is less than #0. 9 is greater than. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619 aboard a Dutch ship traded for supplies. They were listed in colonial records alongside cargo and livestock. Their status was ambiguous at first, perhaps servants, perhaps slaves. The law had not yet hardened into the code that would define American slavery for centuries, but the ambiguity would not last. The tobacco economy demanded labor in quantities the colony could not supply through immigration alone. Indentured servants came by the thousands, but they died, or they ran away, or they completed their terms and demanded their promised land. Planters needed workers they could control absolutely, permanently. African slavery provided the solution. By the 1660s, Virginia was passing laws that made slavery hereditary, that declared children born to enslaved mothers were themselves enslaved, regardless of the father's status. The institution was not some ancient inheritance. It was invented, piece by piece, to serve economic need. The Middle Passage was horror refined to industrial process, Ships packed human beings below decks in spaces too low to stand, too narrow to turn. The crossing took months. People died of disease, of despair, of thirst. Bodies were thrown overboard with the regularity of routine. Survivors arrived, traumatized, weakened, branded with hot irons, and sold on auction blocks like cattle. They came from different kingdoms, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods. Slavery made them all the same in the eyes of the law, property without rights, beings without souls worth considering. The colonies built elaborate legal structures to maintain slavery and prevent resistance. Slave codes defined every aspect of enslaved life: where they could go, what they could wear, whether they could gather in groups or learn to read. Punishments were brutal and public. Whipping, branding, mutilation for infractions, as minor as speaking back to a white person. Rape was not a crime when the victim was enslaved. Murder was barely punished if the victim was black. The codes worked not just through violence, but through psychological warfare, teaching both enslaved and free that this hierarchy was natural, divinely ordained, permanent. Racism was not the cause of slavery, but its product and justification. As the colonies enslaved more Africans, they developed elaborate theories of racial difference to explain why this was acceptable. Africans were said to be naturally suited for labor, insensible to pain, incapable of civilization. These lies were repeated in sermons and legal documents, taught to children, embedded in the foundation of colonial thought. The trade in human flesh became the engine of prosperity. Slave ships were financed by respectable merchants. Slave auctions were advertised in newspapers alongside notices of prayer meetings. The horror was normalized, made ordinary, and then defended as necessary. By the time of the Revolution, slavery was so entrenched that the men who wrote about liberty and equality could not imagine a nation without it. Salem, in 1692, was a town devouring itself. It began with children playing at fortune-telling, reading the future in egg whites dropped into water. It ended with 20 corpses and a community scarred by suspicion that would never fully heal. The first accusations came from young girls experiencing fits, writhing on the floor, claiming invisible hands pinched and choked them, crying out the names of witches who tormented them. The Puritan worldview left no room for psychological explanations or hysterical illness. If the children suffered, someone was causing that suffering through supernatural means. The magistrates took the accusations seriously. Arrest warrants were issued. Women were dragged from their homes and thrown into jail. The trials were theatre masquerading as justice. Spectral evidence was admitted testimony that the accused person's spirit had appeared to the witness and committed harm, even if the accused's body was elsewhere. There was no defense against such charges. How do you prove your spirit did not leave your body and afflict someone? The court accepted the visions of teenage girls as fact and dismissed the protests of accused women as lies. Those who confessed were spared. Those who maintained innocence were condemned. The accused were not random. They were often women who did not fit neatly into Puritan society: the argumentative, the independent, the poor who depended on charity, the wealthy who inspired envy. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar. Rebecca Nurse was a prosperous matriarch whose family had property disputes with the Putnams, whose daughters were among the accusers. Bridget Bishop ran a tavern and dressed in colours the godly found immodest. Giles Corey refused to enter a plea and was pressed to death under heavy stones, killed for his silence. His last words, as more weight was added to his chest, were a demand for more weight defiance to the bitter end. The executions were public, performed on Gallows Hill where the town could watch. 19 were hanged, including ministers who preached their innocence from the scaffold. The crowds that gathered were there to witness justice, or so they told themselves. In truth, they were watching the logical conclusion of a worldview that saw devils everywhere and trusted authority to root them out. The witch panic spread beyond Salem to neighboring towns. Jails filled with the accused. Children testified against parents. Neighbors settled scores with accusations that could not be disproven. The trials ended not because the authorities developed sudden wisdom, but because the accusations began reaching too high. When the accusers named the governor's wife, When respectable Boston merchants found themselves suspected, the system suddenly discovered restraint. The courts reconsidered spectral evidence. The governor issued pardons. By 1693, it was over. Some of the judges later expressed regret. Samuel Sewall stood in church, while a minister read his confession of error. But the dead remained dead, and the community had learned a terrible lesson about what happens when fear replaces reason and power is given to those who claim to see invisible enemies. Colonial law did not recognize women as full persons. They existed in a state of legal coverture, their identities subsumed into their husbands upon marriage. A woman's property became her husband's property. Her wages belonged to him. She could not sign contracts, sue in court, or make a will without his consent. The law treated her as a dependent, perpetually under male authority, father, husband, or in widowhood, sometimes son. The myth of colonial womanhood celebrated virtue and piety. Women were keepers of the hearth, moral guardians, civilizing influences. But virtue in this context meant obedience. A good woman was silent in church, submissive in the home, chaste before marriage, and faithful after. Deviation from these norms invited not just social censure, but legal punishment. Adultery could mean the whipping post. Bearing a child out of wedlock meant public humiliation and fines. Women's bodies were regulated by law and scripture, their sexuality controlled by men who claimed divine authority. Marriage was economic necessity for most women. Without independent means of support, without access to most professions, a woman who did not marry faced poverty or dependence on family charity. The marriage contract was explicit about hierarchy. Wives promised to obey, husbands promised to provide and protect. What happened inside that arrangement was largely beyond the law's reach. Domestic violence was common and rarely prosecuted unless it became extreme. A man could beat his wife as he would correct a child or a servant, so long as he did not permanently maim or kill her. Some women found narrow paths to power. Widows, especially wealthy ones, could manage estates and businesses until they remarried. Some women ran taverns or worked as midwives, gaining respect and modest independence. Anne Bradstreet wrote poetry that was published and praised, though she was careful to frame her work as subordinate to domestic duties. Margaret Brent, in Maryland, owned property and appeared in court more than 100 times defending her interests. But these were exceptions navigating around a system designed to exclude them. The colonial imagination celebrated women who died for virtue. Stories of Indian captivity often focused on women who maintained their piety and chastity despite suffering. But the same society that praised this ideal also sold Native women and African women into slavery, where they had no protection against rape, no legal recourse, no claim to their own bodies or their children. The veneration of white women's purity was built on the degradation of women of color. Virtue was always racialized, always contingent, always a tool of control, rather than a recognition of human dignity. They came by the thousands, seeking escape from poverty, debt, famine, or persecution. They signed contracts that promised them passage to America in exchange for years of labor, typically 4 to 7 years, sometimes more. The system was called indentured servitude, and it was sold as opportunity. For many, it was a slower form of death than outright slavery, but death nonetheless. The voyage across the Atlantic was brutal for servants packed in holds without adequate food, water, or sanitation. Disease spread quickly in the cramped conditions. Those who died were thrown overboard. Survivors arrived weakened and were sold to the highest bidder. Their contracts were commodities traded on the docks. Masters could sell their servants to others, extend terms for misbehavior, or demand additional years if the servant became pregnant or fell ill and missed work. Once bound, servants had few rights. Masters provided food, shelter, and clothing, but the quality varied wildly. Some were treated as temporary members of the household. Others were worked as hard as enslaved people, beaten for perceived laziness, denied adequate nutrition. Running away was common, and so was recapture. The punishment for fleeing was extension of the term, whipping or branding. Colonial newspapers carried advertisements for runaways describing their scars and missing teeth testaments to the violence of the system. The promise was that freedom waited at the end of the term. Servants would receive freedom dues, a set of clothes, some tools, perhaps a small amount of money or land. The reality was often less generous. Masters found reasons to extend terms. Freedom dues were withheld or reduced. The land grants that existed in the early days of colonization disappeared as good land was claimed. By the late 1600s, freed servants faced a landscape where opportunity was scarce and the best positions were already filled. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 revealed the explosive potential of this frustrated class. Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy planter, led a diverse coalition of poor whites and enslaved blacks against the Virginia government, demanding access to native lands and protesting the governor's policies. The rebellion failed, but it terrified the planter elite. Their response was to harden racial lines, to offer poor whites status and small privileges that set them apart from enslaved Africans. The system began to replace white indentured labor with permanent black slavery, calculating that racial hierarchy would prevent future alliances between the dispossessed. Indentured servitude continued into the 18th century, but its character changed. The worst abuses were somewhat curtailed. Terms became more predictable, but the dream of a second chance remained elusive for most. The price of freedom was years of unpaid labor, risk of death from disease or abuse, and arrival into a society that had little use for people without capital or connections. The servants who survived their terms and carved out modest lives were the exceptions. The forgotten majority left only traces in court records and ships' manifests, names without stories, lives consumed by a system that promised much and delivered little. In colonial America, church and state were not separate, but fused into a single apparatus of control. Religion was not merely a private matter of conscience, but the foundation of law, the arbiter of morality, and the instrument of surveillance. To live outside the church was to live outside society itself. In Massachusetts, church membership was required to vote in colony elections. The government collected taxes to support congregational ministers and meeting houses. Every town was required to have a church and a minister. Attendance was not optional. Town officials tracked who appeared at Sunday services and who did not. Absenteeism brought fines or time in the stocks. The government enforced religious uniformity because they believed that a godly commonwealth required a unified faith. Dissent was not freedom but disorder, a threat to the entire community's covenant with God. The clergy wielded power that extended far beyond the pulpit. Ministers advised magistrates, interpreted law through biblical precedent, and shaped public opinion through weekly sermons. A minister's opposition could destroy a political career. His support could legitimize controversial policies. Cotton Mather, the influential Boston minister, wrote pamphlets justifying the Salem witch trials, providing theological cover for judicial murder. Other ministers held similar sway in their communities, their words carrying the weight of divine authority. Censorship was routine and unapologetic. Books deemed heretical or immoral were banned. Printing presses were closely regulated. The first printing press in Massachusetts was overseen by religious authorities who approved every publication. Writing that questioned religious orthodoxy could result in prosecution for blasphemy. Thomas Morton, who established a settlement at Merrymount where colonists and natives traded and celebrated together, was arrested partly for his unorthodox religious views. The Puritans chopped down his maypole and drove him out, unwilling to tolerate even nearby examples of different ways of living. Even private life was subject to religious scrutiny. Neighbors reported neighbors for moral offenses. Churchgoers were expected to monitor each other's behavior and testify against those who sinned. Adultery, fornication, drunkenness, working on the Sabbath, all were crimes prosecuted by civil authorities using biblical law as the standard. The line between sin and crime did not exist. The church defined morality, and the state enforced it with fines, whippings, and executions. Maryland and Pennsylvania were partial exceptions, founded with greater religious tolerance. Catholics found refuge in Maryland, at least initially. Pennsylvania welcomed Quakers and promised liberty of conscience. But even these colonies had limits. Tolerance extended to Christians, rarely to others. Atheists were universally despised and legally disadvantaged. Jews faced restrictions in most colonies. Religious freedom, where it existed, was a narrow corridor, not the open plain the mythology suggests. The colonial church was government, and government was the church. Together, they formed a system of total oversight, where salvation and citizenship were inseparable, where God's will was interpreted by men with power, and where dissent from either religious or political authority could cost you everything. The Caribbean islands were the true jewels of the colonial empire, more valuable to European powers than the entire mainland. Sugar was white gold, a luxury product that created fortunes and fueled the Atlantic economy. The islands were death traps, disease-ridden, brutally hot, worked by enslaved people who died at rates that made the plantations efficient only because the supply of human beings seemed endless. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, these names represented unimaginable wealth for plantation owners and unimaginable suffering for the enslaved. Sugar cultivation required enormous labor under horrific conditions. Cane cutting shredded hands. The boiling houses where juice was processed into sugar and molasses were infernos, where workers suffered burns and exhaustion. The enslaved died so quickly that planters calculated it was cheaper to work people to death and import replacements than to maintain conditions where people might live longer. The ratio of enslaved to free in the Caribbean was often 10-1 or higher. Planters lived in constant fear of rebellion and responded with overwhelming violence. Slave codes in the islands were even more draconian than on the mainland. Punishments included dismemberment, burning alive, and slow execution designed to terrorize others into submission. Rebellions did occur. The enslaved fought back despite impossible odds, but they were suppressed with savage efficiency. The severed heads of rebels were displayed on poles as warnings. The wealth from Caribbean sugar flowed into North American ports. Rum, distilled from Caribbean molasses, became a staple of colonial commerce. New England merchants grew rich, trading food and lumber to the sugar islands and importing molasses to make rum, which was then used to purchase enslaved Africans who were sold in the Caribbean or the southern colonies. This triangular trade bound the mainland colonies to the Caribbean system. Northern merchants profited from slavery even if they owned few enslaved people themselves. The mainland colonies also served as a dumping ground for enslaved people considered too rebellious for the islands. After failed uprisings or when planters wanted to remove troublemakers, they shipped enslaved people to the Carolinas or Virginia. The fear was that these rebels would spread resistance, but the economic calculation outweighed the risk. The mainland's connection to the Caribbean was not peripheral but central. The sugar islands generated the capital that financed expansion, the demand that sustained northern shipping, and the model of racialized plantation slavery that the southern colonies adopted and perfected. The islands were also laboratories of empire, where European powers tested methods of control, labor extraction, and racial governance that would be applied elsewhere. The brutality was not exceptional, but exemplary. When we tell the story of American colonization, we focus on the mainland, on Plymouth and Jamestown, on frontier expansion and revolution. But the wealth that built colonial America, the money that financed its institutions, came in large measure from Caribbean sugar, Caribbean slavery, Caribbean death. The empire of sugar and blood was not separate from American history. It was the engine that made that history possible. The frontier was a zone of constant, grinding violence, where native peoples fought to preserve their lands, and colonists pushed relentlessly forward. The wars were not random outbreaks, but systematic campaigns of dispossession dressed in the language of defense and civilization. The Pequot War of 1637 began with tensions over trade and land, but it ended with near-total destruction. The Pequots were a powerful trading nation who controlled valuable territory in Connecticut. Colonists wanted that land and feared Pequot power. When violence erupted, the English and their native allies surrounded the main Pequot village at Mystic and set it ablaze at dawn. Between 400 and 700 people died, most of them women, children, and elders. The few who escaped were hunted down. Survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean or distributed as servants among the colonists. The Pequot name was banned. The goal was not military victory, but erasure. King Philip's War in 1675 was the costliest war in American history relative to population. Metacom, called King Philip, was the son of Massasoit, who had welcomed the Pilgrims. He watched as colonial settlements spread across Wampanoag lands, as English law was imposed on his people, as men were executed for crimes tried in colonial courts. When war came, it was a desperate attempt to drive the colonists back or be destroyed trying. The conflict raged across New England for more than a year. Native forces attacked dozens of settlements, burning towns and killing hundreds of colonists. The English response was total war, destroying native villages and food supplies, executing prisoners, selling captured warriors and their families into slavery. Native allies of the English were forced to wear identifying markers to prevent them from being killed on sight. The war devastated both sides. English casualties were proportionally enormous, but native losses were catastrophic. Thousands died in battle, of starvation, or of disease. Entire communities were destroyed. Metacom was hunted down in a swamp, shot, beheaded, and quartered. His head was mounted on a pole in Plymouth, where it remained for 20 years. His wife and young son were sold into slavery. These wars established patterns that would repeat across the continent. The cycle was grimly predictable: colonial expansion, native resistance, colonial accusations of savagery, overwhelming military response, land seizure, and the imposition of treaties that would be broken as soon as colonists wanted more land. Each war was justified as defensive, each massacre as necessary. The violence was never acknowledged as conquest, because that would require admitting the land was taken rather than empty, that the people being killed had legitimate claims that were being extinguished by force. The wars also deepened divisions among native peoples. Some nations allied with the English against traditional rivals, hoping to gain advantage or safety. The colonists exploited these divisions ruthlessly, playing nations against each other, rewarding allies with trade goods, and punishing enemies with destruction. By the end of the 17th century, native power in New England was shattered. The survivors lived on small reservations, restricted by colonial law, surrounded by settlements that had swallowed their world. The frontier moved west, and the violence moved with it. The colonies were never united. They were a collection of rival experiments, divided by religion, economy, and social structure, often viewing each other with suspicion and contempt. New England Puritans saw Virginia's tobacco aristocracy as morally lax, too concerned with profit and not enough with godliness. Virginians viewed New Englanders as self-righteous fanatics, hypocrites who preached virtue while engaging in their own profitable trade networks. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, were even more fragmented, home to Dutch, English, German, Swedish settlers, Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Catholics, all competing for influence and land. Economic differences created separate worlds. The northern colonies developed mixed economies based on small farms, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The Chesapeake and the Carolinas built plantation economies dependent on enslaved labor. These different systems bred different societies with conflicting interests. Northern merchants profited from trade with the Caribbean and Europe, but did not share the southern planters' absolute dependence on slavery. This would create tensions that festered for generations. Class divisions fractured every colony. The wealthy monopolized political power and land. The middling sort, small farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, had limited voice. The poor, the indentured, the enslaved, had none. Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, the Paxton Boys' March in Pennsylvania, the regulator movements in the Carolinas, these were internal conflicts where poor and middling colonists turned against elites who they believed exploited and ignored them. The colonial elite feared their own lower classes as much as they feared native resistance or imperial interference. Religious divisions ran deep. Puritans persecuted Quakers. Anglicans distrusted both. Catholics were viewed with suspicion everywhere. their loyalty questioned because of their allegiance to the Pope. When Maryland's Protestant majority seized power from the Catholic proprietors, they passed laws restricting Catholic worship and barring Catholics from office. The myth of religious freedom obscures centuries of sectarian conflict. Race became the one unifying principle, the line that transcended other divisions. Poor whites and wealthy whites might despise each other, but both agreed on the subordination of blacks and native peoples. This racial solidarity was not natural but constructed through law and custom. Slave codes created a category of whiteness that included even the poorest European, giving them legal and social status above any African. This racial hierarchy served as social glue, preventing the cross-racial alliances that terrified the elite. The colonies cooperated rarely and reluctantly. Proposals for colonial union were rejected because no colony wanted to surrender autonomy or pay for common defense. When they did cooperate, it was usually to wage war against native peoples or respond to imperial demands. The idea of American unity came late, and only under the pressure of conflict with Britain. Before independence, the colonies were separate societies with separate identities, bound together mainly by shared subjugation to the same empire and shared commitment to racial hierarchy. The unity celebrated in revolutionary mythology was invented by necessity, not inherited from colonial experience. Disease was the invisible conqueror, more deadly than any army, more effective than any weapon. The Americas had been largely isolated from the epidemiological exchanges that shaped Eurasia and Africa. When Europeans arrived, they brought smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and plague diseases, against which native populations had no immunity. The die-off began before sustained colonization. Spanish conquistadors in the Caribbean and Mexico unleashed epidemics that killed millions. By the time English colonists arrived in Virginia and Massachusetts, waves of disease had already swept through coastal populations. The Wampanoag people who encountered the Pilgrims had been devastated by an epidemic just a few years earlier, their population reduced by perhaps 90%. The colonists saw empty villages and fields returning to forest and interpreted this as divine providence, God clearing the land for his chosen people. Smallpox was the most devastating. It spread rapidly through communities with no previous exposure, killing 30% or more of those infected. Survivors were often left scarred and weakened. Entire villages could be depopulated in weeks. The social fabric of native societies unraveled under the onslaught. Leaders died before they could pass on knowledge. Healers had no remedies that worked. The spiritual explanations that made sense of other calamities failed in the face of this invisible enemy. The colonists understood disease was spreading but rarely tried to prevent it. Sometimes they used it deliberately. During Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, British officers discussed distributing smallpox-infected blankets to native peoples, and there is evidence they attempted it. Whether this particular instance succeeded is debated, but the intent reveals how colonists viewed disease as a tool of conquest. Even when biological warfare was not deliberate, the effect was the same. Every trade contact, every diplomatic meeting, every battle carried the risk of infection. The demographic collapse cannot be overstated. Estimates suggest that native populations in the Americas declined by 90% or more in the century and a half after contact. Entire peoples vanished. Languages died with their last speakers. Agricultural knowledge, astronomical observations, medicinal practices, all lost. The emptying of the land made colonization possible. The English and French moved into territories that had recently supported dense populations, farming land that had been cleared and managed for generations. Disease also shaped colonial society. The Chesapeake colonies had high mortality rates from malaria and other diseases, creating a society where people lived fast and died young. New England was healthier, allowing families to grow and communities to stabilize across generations. The Caribbean was a graveyard for Europeans and Africans alike, with yellow fever and other tropical diseases maintaining death rates that required constant importation of new enslaved labor. The biological conquest was not an accident or a tragedy that happened alongside colonization. It was the foundation that made colonization possible. Without the die-off, Europeans could not have established their settlements or pushed inland. The land was not empty. It was emptied. The New World was built on a grave so vast that bones littered the soil for generations. Disease cleared the way for empire, and the colonists thanked their God for the providential timing. The contradictions were present from the beginning, visible to anyone willing to see them. Men wrote constitutions, guaranteeing the rights of Englishmen, while holding other human beings in permanent bondage. They spoke of liberty while displacing native peoples from their ancestral lands. They built representative governments that represented only a narrow slice of the population. These contradictions did not weaken the revolutionary impulse in some ways, they fueled it. The colonists' understanding of freedom was intensely personal and intensely selective. They believed free men should not be taxed without representation, that they had rights to property and self-governance. But free men was a category with sharp boundaries. Women, the enslaved, native peoples, often the poor, none of these were included in the revolutionary promise. Liberty meant the liberty of some to dominate others, to own land, to participate in markets, to govern themselves without interference from distant authority. The colonial experience with unfreedom made revolutionaries acutely sensitive to any perceived threat to their own liberty. Planters who held hundreds of people in bondage nonetheless spoke of themselves as slaves to British tyranny. They saw taxation and regulation as a tax on their fundamental rights, even as they denied those same rights to the people who worked their fields. The irony was not lost on everyone. Samuel Johnson famously asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" Some colonists did recognize the contradiction. The Society of Friends, the Quakers, began to organize against slavery in the mid-1700s. Individual voices, like those of Judge Samuel Sewall in Massachusetts, argued that slavery violated Christian principles, but these remained minority positions. Most colonists, even those who found slavery distasteful, could not imagine a society without it, or were unwilling to sacrifice the prosperity it generated. The enslaved themselves understood freedom more clearly than their masters. They ran away, they resisted, they formed maroon communities in swamps and mountains. They sued for their freedom in colonial courts, sometimes successfully. Crispu Attucks, a man of African and native descent, was among the first to die in the Boston Massacre, shot by British soldiers in 1770. The revolution would be fought partly by enslaved men promised freedom in exchange for military service, a promise sometimes honoured and often betrayed. By the 1770s, the colonies had developed enough sense of separate identity from Britain to imagine independence. They had their own economies, their own institutions, their own grievances against imperial control. But the society they had built was a house divided against itself, founded on principles it did not extend universally, sustained by systems of exploitation it could not acknowledge without calling into question the entire enterprise. The seeds of revolution were growing, but they were rooted in soil soaked with the blood and sweat of those who would not be free when independence came. The promise of liberty was real, but so were the limits. The question of who deserved freedom and who did not would haunt the new nation from its birth. Misery was an industry, suffering a commodity to be bought and sold. The colonial economy was built on the systematic extraction of value from human pain, and everyone from merchant princes to small shopkeepers participated in the trade. The most obvious profits came from slavery. Ship captains and merchants financed voyages to Africa, purchased human beings with trade goods, transported them across the Atlantic, and sold them at auction. The profit margins were substantial enough to justify the horror. Insurance policies covered slave cargoes against loss during the Middle Passage. Banks in London, Bristol, and Amsterdam extended credit for these ventures. Investment in slavery was considered safe and respectable. Plantation owners extracted wealth through forced labor. Tobacco, rice, indigo, sugar. These crops generated fortunes for families who would build dynasties on the foundation of slavery. The labor was uncompensated, the hours unlimited, the conditions brutal. Every hogshead of tobacco, every barrel of rice represented stolen life, years of human existence converted into profit for someone else. The enslaved created the wealth, but received only enough to survive, and sometimes not even that. Northern colonies participated through trade and manufacturing. New England distilleries converted Caribbean molasses into rum. Rhode Island merchants dominated the North American slave trade in the 18th century, their ships carrying thousands of Africans into bondage. New York, Philadelphia, and Boston merchants provided the manufactured goods, cloth, tools, weapons used to purchase enslaved people in Africa. They imported sugar, tobacco, and rice from the South and the Caribbean. They built the ships, supplied the provisions, insured the cargoes. The entire commercial network was entangled with slavery. Indentured servitude provided another stream of profit. Ship captains transported servants and sold their contracts upon arrival. Merchants extended credit to planters who purchased servants' labor. The system worked because it converted human desperation into commercial opportunity. Poor Europeans fleeing poverty signed away years of their lives, and that signature became a negotiable asset. Land speculation turned native displacement into profit. Wealthy colonists acquired vast tracts through questionable treaties or dubious claims. They held the land until settlements expanded, then sold it at enormous markup. The suffering of native peoples, forced from their homes, translated directly into capital gains for land companies and individual speculators. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and many other prominent colonists were deeply involved in land speculation, their fortunes built partly on trading territory taken from native nations. The fur trade depended on exploitation of native labor and resources. Traders provided alcohol and manufactured goods to native hunters, often creating dependencies and debts that bound hunters to unfavorable terms. The trade depleted animal populations and disrupted native economies, but it enriched merchants and trading companies. The suffering was ecological and human, but the profits were real and substantial. Even religion was monetized. Ministers received salaries from mandatory taxes. Church construction projects enriched builders and suppliers. The need to maintain appearances of godliness created markets for appropriate clothing and household items. Salvation might be free, but performing piety had costs that flowed into various pockets. The colonial economy was not separate from these systems of exploitation, but identical with them. There was almost no significant accumulation of wealth that did not rely on some form of coerced labor or dispossession. The profits of pain built the ports, financed the businesses, educated the elite, and established the institutions that would persist long after the colonial period ended. When we speak of colonial prosperity, we are speaking of wealth extracted from people who had no choice, who received nothing, who suffered and died to make others rich. Justice in colonial America was public theater, a performance designed to terrify and instruct. The criminal code was harsh, the punishments brutal, the executions meant to be witnessed by the entire community. Hanging was the most common method of execution, performed on permanent gallows or temporary scaffolds built for the occasion. Convicted criminals were paraded through town to the execution site, sometimes forced to wear signs describing their crimes. Ministers accompanied them, urging repentance. The condemned were expected to make speeches acknowledging their guilt and warning others against following their path. These final words were published as pamphlets and sold as moral lessons. The bodies were often left hanging for hours or days as warnings. Lesser crimes brought lesser punishments, but they were no less public. The whipping post stood in town centres. Offenders were stripped and beaten with a catto, ninetails or wooden rod while neighbours watched. The number of lashes varied with the crime: 10 for drunkenness, 20 for theft, 30 or more for serious offences. Thieves might also be branded, the letter T burned into their thumb or forehead, so they would carry the mark of their crime forever. The stocks and the pillory were instruments of humiliation. Offenders were locked in place in the town square, heads and hands or feet immobilized. They stood or sat there for hours while townspeople mocked them, threw garbage, and pelted them with stones or rotten food. The shame was the point as much as the physical discomfort. The community participated actively in the punishment, turning moral judgment into collective action. Branding was common for repeat offenders or serious crimes. Heated irons seared letters into flesh, B for burglar, R for rogue, T for thief. Some colonies branded enslaved people who ran away, marking them for easier identification if they attempted flight again. The practice turned the body into a permanent record of transgression, impossible to hide or erase. Mutilation was sometimes imposed for specific crimes. Ears were cropped for forgery or perjury. Hands were occasionally severed for theft. These punishments were relatively rare, but made powerful examples. The maimed person carried visible proof of what happened when you violated the community's laws. For the enslaved, punishment was even more savage and arbitrary. Whipping was routine, not reserved for specific offences, but used for any perceived disobedience or failure to work fast enough. Enslavers could beat, brand, or mutilate enslaved people with virtual impunity. Slave codes authorized punishments, up to and including execution, for running away repeatedly or for striking a white person. The brutality was not incidental but central to the system, designed to break spirits and enforce total submission. Native peoples faced violence that was often extrajudicial. In frontier areas, colonists might kill native people with little fear of prosecution. When native people were tried in colonial courts, the proceedings were often perfunctory and the outcomes predetermined. After King Philip's War, dozens of native prisoners were executed or sold into slavery without formal trials. The law protected colonists, but it rarely protected those the colonists viewed as enemies or obstacles. The public nature of punishment was not accidental. It served multiple purposes: revenge against the offender, deterrence for potential criminals, reinforcement of community values, and demonstration of the state's power. Everyone was expected to watch and internalize the lesson. Children were brought to executions to learn the cost of sin. The body in pain, or the body on the gallows, was a text that everyone could read, a sermon in flesh about the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries the community enforced. Before African slavery became the dominant labor system, before the transatlantic trade reached its full industrial horror, colonists enslaved native peoples. This commerce in indigenous lives was older than most histories acknowledge and more extensive than the national memory preserves. The Pequot War of 1637 ended not only with massacre but with enslavement. Survivors of the Mystic Attack and other battles were divided among the victorious colonists and their native allies. Some were kept as servants in New England. Others were shipped to the Caribbean, sold to sugar plantations where they would likely die within a few years. The Pequot nation was shattered not just by violence but by the dispersal of its people across an ocean. King Philip's War produced even more enslaved captives. After Metacom's defeat, hundreds of native prisoners were sold into slavery. Metacom's own wife and young son were among those shipped to the Caribbean. Colonial authorities calculated that selling prisoners was profitable and removed potential sources of resistance. Men who had fought for their lands spent their remaining days cutting cane under the Caribbean sun. Women and children were distributed as household servants or shipped away. Families were destroyed as thoroughly as villages. The Carolinas developed an extensive trade in native slaves that predated the dominance of African slavery in the region. Colonists armed allied native nations and encouraged them to raid rival peoples for captives. The captives were marched to Charleston and sold. Thousands of native people from the interior southeast were enslaved this way: Choctaws, Chickasaws, Yamasees, and many others. The trade disrupted entire regions, creating cycles of warfare as nations raided each other for captives to trade for European goods. The Spanish in Florida and the French in Louisiana also participated in enslaving native peoples, though the English colonists pursued it most aggressively. The practice created animosity among native nations and weakened their ability to resist European expansion. It also generated profits that helped finance colonial development. Slaveholders preferred African slaves eventually because Africans were less likely to escape successfully into familiar territory, and because the supply could be replenished through the Atlantic trade, but native slavery persisted well into the 18th century. Enslaved native people faced particular challenges. They knew the landscape and often attempted escape, running to allied nations or disappearing into the backcountry. Enslavers responded by selling native slaves far from their homelands or by shipping them to distant colonies. A native person enslaved in South Carolina might be sent to New England or the Caribbean, making escape or return almost impossible. The laws regarding native slavery varied, but generally treated indigenous people as a distinct category from African slaves. Some colonies eventually banned enslaving native people from within their borders, but continued to permit importing native slaves from other regions. The distinctions were about politics and practicality, not morality. Native nations were potential allies or enemies, and enslaving them risked provoking wars. Africans had no nations nearby to retaliate. The native slave trade is largely forgotten because it was eventually overshadowed by the scale of African slavery and because its victims left fewer traces in the historical record. Enslaved Africans were more often documented in estate records, bills of sale, and census counts. Enslaved native peoples frequently appear only obliquely in colonial records, their origins obscured, their fates unrecorded. But the trade was real and extensive, another strand in the colonial economy of human suffering, another chapter in the dispossession and destruction of indigenous peoples. The colonies built their prosperity on multiple systems of bondage, and native slavery was among the first. The colonies we remember are not the colonies that existed. Somewhere between the brutal reality and the triumphant present, the story was rewritten. The myths we inherited were deliberately constructed by later generations who needed the past to justify the present. By the 19th century, America needed an origin story that matched its self-image as a land of freedom and opportunity. The Pilgrims became symbols of religious liberty rather than religious intolerance. Jamestown was remembered for perseverance, not for the starvation and violence that nearly destroyed it. The founders were elevated to demigods whose every action seemed guided by providence toward the creation of a perfect union. The mythology required forgetting. Native peoples were written out of the story or reduced to minor characters in someone else's drama. When they appeared at all, it was as noble savages helping the Pilgrims or as obstacles to manifest destiny. The complexity of native societies, the legitimacy of their resistance, the horror of their destruction, all disappeared into a haze of inevitability. The land was empty wilderness before the colonists arrived, or so the story went. The fact that it was full of people who were systematically killed or removed could not be acknowledged without questioning the entire narrative. Slavery was minimized or regionalized. It became a Southern problem, an unfortunate exception to American ideals rather than a foundational reality. The complicity of Northern merchants, the integration of slave-produced goods into the entire colonial economy, the wealth that slavery generated for people who never owned slaves, these facts were inconvenient and therefore forgotten. Textbooks taught that some colonists owned slaves while most were pursuing freedom and building democracy, as if these were separate stories running on parallel tracks. The mythology emphasized unity and common purpose, where division and conflict actually existed. Colonial America became a rehearsal for independence, every event reinterpreted as a step toward revolution. The Mayflower Compact became an early constitution. Town meetings became models of democracy. Religious diversity became proof of tolerance. The messy reality of sectarian violence, class conflict, and exploitation was smoothed into a narrative of steady progress toward liberty. The language changed too. Conquest became settlement. Invasion became expansion. Ethnic cleansing became civilization spreading across the wilderness. Enslaved people became servants. Genocide became the unfortunate but inevitable result of cultural contact. The words were chosen carefully to obscure agency and responsibility. Things happened to native peoples and enslaved Africans. Colonists did not do things to them. The grammar itself hid the violence. This mythology served purposes beyond nostalgia. It justified continued expansion westward in the 19th century. If the original colonists had a divine right to settle North America, then their descendants had the same right to push to the Pacific. It justified the racial order. If the founders built a great nation despite slavery rather than because of it, then the nation could continue without addressing the legacy of bondage. It provided comfort in difficult times. When the country faced crises, politicians invoked the mythical past where everything was simpler and everyone agreed on fundamental values. Schools taught this sanitized version for generations. Children learned about the first Thanksgiving without learning about the Pequot Massacre. They memorized the Mayflower Compact without reading the slave codes. They celebrated colonial ingenuity without confronting colonial brutality. The curriculum was designed to create patriots, not critics. The myths became common knowledge, repeated so often they felt like truth. The process of myth-making was not entirely cynical. People genuinely believed in the story they told. They needed to believe that the nation was founded on noble principles, that the suffering had purpose, that the arc of history bent toward justice. Acknowledging the full truth would require confronting uncomfortable questions about whose freedom was purchased with others' bondage, whose prosperity rested on stolen land, whose rights were protected by denying rights to others. The myths were comforting lies that allowed the nation to move forward without looking too closely at the foundation. The revolution promised liberty, but its roots were tangled in oppression. What happens when a nation's founding myths are built on denial? By the 1770s, the colonies had become something unprecedented, societies born from displacement and exploitation, devoted to ideals of freedom while practicing multiple forms of bondage. The contradiction was not a flaw in the system, but the system itself. The liberty the revolutionaries sought was always conditional, always bounded by assumptions about who deserved rights and who existed to serve. The men who would write declarations of independence and frame constitutions owned human beings. They lived on land taken by force and fraud. They built their fortunes on trade networks sustained by suffering. Yet they spoke eloquently about natural rights, the consent of the governed, and the tyranny of arbitrary power. They were not hypocrites. Exactly, they believed their own words. They simply did not extend those principles beyond the narrow circle they considered fully human. The enslaved understood the contradiction more clearly than anyone. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, enslaved people reading those words knew they were excluded from all men. When the Revolution spoke of liberty or death, thousands of enslaved people chose the British side, seeking freedom from the patriots who claimed to fight for freedom. The British promised emancipation to those who fled their rebel masters. It was a cynical offer, a military tactic, but it was more than the revolutionaries offered. After the war, those who fought for the British were evacuated to Nova Scotia, Jamaica, or Sierra Leone free, but exiled from the country they helped to liberate. Native nations faced an impossible choice. The revolution was a conflict between two colonizing powers, neither of which respected indigenous sovereignty. Most nations that took sides supported the British, calculating that the Crown's policies limiting westward expansion were preferable to the colonists' land hunger. They were right about the colonists' intentions but wrong about the outcome. After independence, the new American government pursued expansion more aggressively than the British ever had. The revolution did not bring native peoples liberty but intensified their dispossession. The revolutionaries inherited and continued the colonial systems they had built. The Constitution protected slavery, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes while denying them any rights. It said nothing about the status of native nations, leaving that question to be resolved by force over the next century. The new nation preserved the hierarchies of the old colonies, merely removing the British from the top of the pyramid. Yet the revolutionary ideals were real and powerful. The words outlived their author's intentions. When Jefferson wrote of inalienable rights, he created a standard by which his own society could be judged and found wanting. Abolitionists would quote the Declaration of Independence. Suffragists would demand the rights the revolution promised but did not deliver. Civil rights activists would call America to live up to its founding principles. The gap between ideal and reality became a tool for those excluded to claim inclusion. The colonial period ended with a revolution that was both liberation and continuation. It freed colonists from empire while preserving the imperial relationship between white settlers and everyone else. It proclaimed universal rights while maintaining particular oppressions. It promised a new birth of freedom while carrying forward the sins of the past. What happens when a nation's founding myths are built on denial? The myths persist, and so does the denial. The contradictions remain unresolved because resolving them would require admitting that the foundation was cracked from the beginning. The story of colonial America is not a simple tale of freedom or oppression, but both at once, inseparably bound. To understand the nation that emerged, we must see it whole, the ideals and the betrayals, the courage and the cruelty, the freedom claimed and the freedom denied. The shadows do not erase the light, but neither does the light dispel the shadows. Both are real, both are part of what was built, and both remain part of what we inherit. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.